Thank you all so much for coming back. In the meantime, I might get started just with like some small introductions, and then we'll take it from there. But this just is shaping up to just be such an interesting panel. So basically, we're starting with Sahar Ahmed, who will be talking about persecution in perpetuity, reforming definitional lacunae in international refugee law. And this looks like such a fascinating and very necessary talk about the international legislations needed to protect those crossing borders. Similarly, on this theme of borders, then Simran Dhingra will be talking about borders, memory and trauma, narratives from the forgotten India, what she calls the intricate mosaic of varied ethnicities in this area, and the impact of borders on the situation too. I think anyway, I will let the speakers speak for themselves soon. And so Roisin Costello will then be with the very concise, interesting title, Smart Borders, Vulnerable Subjects. She'll be talking about the smart border policies and how this affects populations or communities in border areas. And then finally, Dr. Soad Bagli Barbar will be talking about pandemic heterotopias, really fascinating, migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, which looks to draw on like Foucault and lots of just really interesting theory. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sahar now. Sahar Ahmed is a PhD student researching the right to freedom of religion within the international human rights legal system and Islamic jurisprudence. Sahar graduated from the University of London's International Programme in 2010 with an LLB honours degree, being called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2011. Sahar practiced as a commercial and corporate barrister in Lahore, appearing before the courts as an advocate of the High Courts of Pakistan. Thank you all so much. And so, yeah, Sahar, take it away.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I apologize for not having a spiffy PowerPoint, so you'll just have to bear with seeing my face the whole time. But thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you for putting on such an amazing conference so far. I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of the speakers as well. So, following the public lynching and burning alive of a Christian couple in November of 2014, for allegedly desecrating the Quran and thereby committing blasphemy, the then Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mia Muhammad Nawaz Sharif, was reported as having said, "A responsible state cannot tolerate mob rule and public lynching with impunity. The Pakistani state has to act proactively to protect its minorities from violence and injustice." Unfortunately, the Prime Minister's words ring hollow. According to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom 2021 annual report, in 2020, religious freedom conditions in Pakistan continued to worsen, and that Pakistan's religiously discriminatory legislation contributed to egregious human rights abuses and fostered an overall atmosphere of intolerance for religious minorities that often leads to violence and discrimination. So although and it almost seems wrong at the moment to call it an endemic, but of religiously motivated intolerance and violence continuously affects all religious minorities within Pakistan. Of particular importance due to their special legal status are the Ahmadi Muslims. The Ahmadi Muslim community of Pakistan, also sometimes referred to as the Ahmadiyas and derogatorily as Qadianis, poses a unique dilemma for the international human rights community and for Pakistan itself. They're persecuted for their heterodox theology regarding Islam. They're considered heretics or infidels in many parts of the Muslim world, but none like in Pakistan, where many mainstream Muslims believe that due to their infidel status, they should not have a right to exist in an Islamic state. Many scholars have noted that Ahmadis are the most persecuted Muslim religious group today, with others labeling the issue of the Ahmadiyas as yet another form of apartheid in all its gory intent and insensate content. With such strong language being used to describe the injustices suffered by the Ahmadis of Pakistan, it's no wonder that numerous human rights organizations around the world have taken up the task of documenting atrocities being committed against them. Minority Rights Group International has reported that the marginalization and persecution of Ahmadis has reached extreme levels in recent years, and Ahmadis are now the target of a sustained and vicious hate campaign. They live in constant fear of harassment or assault, either to themselves or their homes, workplaces, and places of worship. Ahmadis do not have the conventional means of redress in that they cannot approach their government for help. The Pakistani state, through its many regressive legislative measures taken against Ahmadis, has effectively sanctioned the persecution they face. A cursory glance at the legislation shows that in 1974, Ahmadis were constitutionally declared non-Muslims by the Pakistani parliament on the basis that they violate the Islamic doctrine of the finality of prophethood of Muhammad. This was despite their fervent belief that they are indeed Muslims and their denial of all such allegations against them. Following what was an already growing trend in the persecution against Ahmadis, in 1984, the then President Zia-ul-Haq enacted the anti-Islamic activities of the Qadiani group as part of an ordinance, as part of his Islamization campaign. This law forbade Ahmadis from posing as Muslims and completely infringed Ahmadi Muslims' right to freedom of their religion. Over the years, successive Pakistani governments have further tightened restrictions faced by the Ahmadi community in various ways that ensure discrimination in their everyday lives. Even the mundane act of applying for or renewing a passport, for example, involves signing a derogatory statement vilifying the Ahmadi faith, without which the applicant cannot claim to be a Muslim. So therefore, Pakistan has effectively not only made it impossible for Ahmadis to live as Muslims in the country, but it's also ensured that discriminating against them is mandatory for other citizens to be called Muslims too. With this problem having been exacerbated, frankly speaking, to the point of no return, Pakistan has, for all intents and purposes, become an impossible option to live in for Ahmadis. Due to this, thousands of Ahmadis have fled the country to seek asylum abroad. The United Kingdom is of particular preference due to the fact that the community's exiled leadership is housed there. It is therefore the aim of this paper to highlight that the only form of redress that Ahmadis have who face persecution in Pakistan is to seek asylum in other countries. This paper also explores the idea that despite asylum already being granted to many Pakistani Ahmadis, the systemic nature of the persecution is such that since it's neither going to abate, nor will conditions improve, as it is not contingent on, for example, an armed conflict taking place or a war having broken out, states accepting Ahmadi asylum seekers need to reevaluate their asylum policies by considering Ahmadi's asylum as by considering granting Ahmadi's asylum as a community through group determination. This paper evaluates how the lack of any definition of one of the most important words found within international refugee law, persecution, allows for the perpetuation of further discrimination and violence. This discussion also proves how the current asylum process universally begs to be reformed. It will be argued that whilst this needs to be done across the board for all asylum seekers generally, it is particularly important for vulnerable groups such as Ahmadis, and Ahmadis pose an example that can be applied across the board for other groups like them. For such groups, it is argued that the standardized system wherein membership of the group, in this case being an Ahmadi, should be reason enough to be granted asylum and thereby refugee status, effectively removing the need for individual assessment of each claim. This is an ambitious standard, I admit, and it might not be practical for adjudicating asylum cases of all future asylum seekers, but it most certainly can be implemented for groups like Ahmadis, and a thorough study of their persecution will showcase the need for it as well. So I've been talking a lot about them, but it is important to sort of contextualize historically who the Ahmadis are. So like I said earlier, Ahmadi Muslims are members of a religious denomination within Islam. They staunchly consider themselves to be members of the greater Muslim Ummah. You might have heard that word in the news, which means community. And their version of Islamic theology, they say, is within the pale of Islam. Worldwide membership of the community is said to be in the tens of millions, as per the community's own estimate. However, the number of Ahmadis presently in Pakistan is not only hotly contested, but it's also grossly outdated. We did in Pakistan recently have a census in 2018 after a 10-year gap, but the figures at the moment available officially are still from 1998 because the 2018 census results have not been released by the government due to the fact that it's an incredibly political topic and the changing demographics can affect the political parties in power. And so based on the 1998 figures, the Ahmadi population officially comprises approximately 0.22% of Pakistan's total population. However, as I said earlier, this figure is contested by the community. And while official statistics say that the community is officially numbered at less than about 500,000, other sources estimate it could be anywhere between 600,000 and into many millions. The fundamental difference between Ahmadis and the Sunni Muslim majority in Pakistan is on a theological issue concerning the identity of the promised Messiah. Ahmadis considered the founder of their movement, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, to have been the said Messiah, whereas the Sunni majority does not. But the religious debate around the claims of prophethood of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed are complicated. They fall mainly within Islamic jurisprudence and therefore don't really require us to go into a detailed discussion, because I promise you delving into the theological intricacies of this will involve an entirely separate set of exigencies which are beyond the scope of this paper, however interesting they may be. But what is of importance in this is the fact that it is this difference in belief itself which forms the basis of the persecution that the Ahmadi community faces in Pakistan. Mirza Ghulam Ahmed's claim to prophethood is what is deemed blasphemous by the Sunni majority and has resulted in their continuing persecution. As stated before, in 1974, the Socialist Democratic Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto amended Pakistan's constitution based on a lot of pressure from right-wing populist parties to define the term Muslim in the constitution. And in the Pakistani context, there were a group of listed groups were included in the constitution, which legally speaking are non-Muslim. This group now included Ahmadis, and they were now deprived of their status as Muslims. Anne Elizabeth Mayer has very rightly pointed out that the experience of the Ahmadi minority provides an illustration of how when governments adopt official Islamic ideologies, Muslims who adhere to minority sects may be demoted by government policy to the category of non-Muslims and punished if they dare to protest that they are. True to her words, whilst Ahmadis have thus far only been demoted to the category of non-Muslim, the punishment was yet to follow. So despite the fact that Ahmadis had now been relegated to a lesser class of people in Pakistan, the non-Muslims, they were still free to practice their faith as and how they wished. They could continue worshipping as Muslims without any interference, even though there were like a lot of social ramifications to being labeled an infidel. Businesses suffered, children had to declare their faith before going to school, relationships, interpersonal relationships in community began to suffer. But legally, they were still allowed to go about their lives without any real kind of punishment. The real blow to the freedom of their religion came under President Ziaul Haq's Islamization policies. He is very famously quoted as having said in 1985 at a national conference, "We will persevere in our effort to ensure that the cancer of Qadianism is exterminated." Qadianis, as I said, is a slur for Ahmadis. So in 1984, the Pakistani government passed the Anti-Islamic Activities of the Qadiani Group, which was to amend the Pakistan Penal Code by adding Ahmadi-specific criminal offenses, which effectively made it wholly illegal for Ahmadis to exist as a religious collective within Pakistan. At a glance, the ordinance was to prevent Ahmadis from calling themselves Muslim, something they continue to do despite being labeled non-Muslim. But in order to make this effective, the ordinance attacked every aspect of Ahmadi life so as to ensure that there is absolutely no chance of any Muslim being deceived into thinking that an Ahmadi may be Muslim. So in order to be all-encompassing, the ordinance made it a criminal offense for Ahmadis to pose as Muslims or to refer to their faith as Islam. Small, mundane, everyday tasks, everyday actions such as, you might have heard Assalamu alaikum being said by Muslims, became a criminal offense. Writing any Islamic terminology on invitations for ceremonies, for weddings, using the term Bismillah on stationery, displaying a Quranic verse on a sign or a calendar, reciting the Quran aloud, offering funeral prayers, etc. All of these became criminal. In order to understand the context and the importance of these actions, it's essential to know that the aforementioned acts are all part of everyday life of all Muslims, not just in Pakistan, but the entire Islamic world. They're integral to the spiritual and religious life of a Muslim. So being restricted to perform any or all of them is a direct violation of an individual's freedom of religion. Another addition to the criminal legal system that was made under Zia's Islamization policies were the Blasphemy Laws, under which anyone who is found guilty of having committed blasphemy by insulting or using derogatory remarks against the Prophet Muhammad will be sentenced to death. This further compounded the persecution faced by Ahmadis because the Pakistani government considered the Ahmadi belief in the prophethood of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad itself to be blasphemous. So that meant that even by merely continuing to call themselves Ahmadis, let alone Muslims, Ahmadis were committing blasphemy and therefore were sentenced to death. The purpose of highlighting these very grim incidents is singular: to illustrate how life for an Ahmadi in Pakistan has become excessively difficult. With the widely held belief that it is unlikely that society is going to change its views on capital punishments for blasphemers anytime soon, or that the blasphemy laws and apostasy laws would be removed from Pakistan's criminal code, or even that would be modified, it appears that the status quo vis-a-vis Ahmadis in Pakistan will continue. As the hate towards Ahmadis becomes more and more institutionalized, the fear becomes equally more entrenched. In a scenario such as this, it has become imperative for the international human rights community to protect Ahmadis through whatever means may be necessary. This paper therefore argues that the only solution left to improve their condition is to increase asylum-based protection. But how? This leads us to refugee law, which is what they need to access in order to be granted this protection. Now, Article 14.1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. In furtherance to this, the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is the seminal repository of international refugee law, lays down certain conditions on who might be able to fully exercise that right. The Refugee Convention therefore defines refugee as someone owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, and is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. And it goes on like this. As explained by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees itself, the difference between asylum seekers and refugees is that asylum seeker is generally a term for a person who has not yet received a decision on their claim for refugee status. It could refer to someone who has not yet submitted an application or someone who is waiting for an answer. Not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, but many do and many will. But there are two things of particular importance within this aforementioned definition that I just read out in the text of the Refugee Convention that are worthy of analysis. Firstly, there is no definition of persecution. Secondly, of equal importance is how refugee status and asylum are only spoken of in terms of the individual. The UNHCR states that the right to seek asylum requires that individual asylum seekers have access to fair and efficient procedures for the examination of their claim. It goes on to define group determination as when it is obvious that large numbers of people are fleeing armed conflict or other mass violations of human rights, it is neither practical nor necessary to examine individual claims for refugee status. Therefore, refugee status can only be given to more than one individual or a group if there is a refugee emergency, as they have called it, or a large-scale influx. We saw this relatively recently after the conflict broke out in Syria, and we saw a large influx of refugees coming into Europe. When deciding on whether or not to define this term, persecution, we find quite a few opinions. The seminal immigration judge of the United Kingdom's Tribunal on Immigrations, Hugo Story, who's very recently retired, notes that when we attempt to seek out a definition for the word in its refugee-related context, we are met by a Greek chorus of commentators telling us in hushed and reverent tones that to define persecution would be sacrilegious. Goodwin, Gill, and McAdam, noted scholars of refugee law, state most emphatically that persecution is a concept only too readily filled by the latest examples of one person's inhumanity to another. It's a very grim sounding term, but it's practical. And so the reasons examined so far for not wanting to define persecution range from being the fear that no one wants to be too restrictive, but also moralistically. If persecution will keep evolving, then we need to be fluid. However, countering this is the fact that not having a working definition leads to extreme ambiguity and allows individual state parties free rein to develop their own definitions of persecution. But when dealing with the Refugee Convention or legislation of this kind, it would undermine its purpose if persecution were given one definition in one country and a completely different definition in another. Due to the fact that there is no definition of persecution and therefore no list of what kind of behavior counts as persecution, states and academics alike have adopted different interpretations of the word in order to explain their arguments. Many states have adopted national legislation where they do attempt to regulate and define it. For example, Australia in 2003 amended their Migration Act of 1958 to include a definition. United States of America refuses to pass any legislation. And so the task is usually left to the judiciary of states to decide. In 2002, the UNHCR's then Director of International Protection explained that persecution cannot and should not be defined solely on the basis of serious human rights violations. Severe discrimination or the cumulative effect of various measures not in themselves alone amounting to persecution, as well as their combination with other adverse factors, can give rise to a well-founded form of persecution, or otherwise said, make life in the country of origin so insecure from many perspectives for the individual concerned that the only way out of this predicament is to leave the country of origin. If looked at through the lens of the Ahmadis in Pakistan, it is very possible that their persecution might not and sometimes does not pass the test if we were to limit this definition. But then why not collective? I keep talking about group determination and maybe giving them asylum collectively. Because the collectivization of individual rights towards achieving the welfare of people is a challenging notion. International law doesn't like it. It's rather hesitant to grant particular rights to groups like this. There are two broad reasons for this. One is that states are wary of collective entitlements. And secondly, because there's also the argument in favor of individualization of rights to offer most protection and remedies to the immediate victim. However, violence and persecution faced by Ahmadis in Pakistan is solely due to their belonging to a specific minority religious group. Therefore, the kind of persecution that Ahmadis face in Pakistan can easily be categorized as collective violence, violence which cannot be seen as an isolated act, but is in fact due to political, religious, or social conflict. If collective violence is perpetrated on people by first identifying them as belonging to a group, who are then consequently made victims, they are being persecuted as a group. And I promise I'll be really brief and wrap up quickly. But it has been argued that although the debate about the distinction and importance of individual and collective rights is important, in terms of refugee rights, it's not relevant. I had such a row with my master's supervisor, dissertation supervisor about this because he was like, it's just not relevant. And this has been argued because refugee status is always based on individual evaluation, even in cases where the claim is that one is of a member of a group, ethnic, religious, or otherwise, which is being targeted. And it is admitted that this may overlap between an individual claim for refugee status on the grounds of being a member of a persecuted minority. It's still asserted that refugee law is only concerned with the former claim, the latter merely providing context. I completely disagree with this. Being heavily persecuted on the basis of the fact that you belong to a group, which is the only reason you are being persecuted at all, with all of the members of that group being persecuted in the same or worse fashion all over the country of origin, with the involvement of both state apparatus and non-state actors, cannot and should not be the source of merely providing context. By denying persecuted minority groups such as Ahmadis appropriate protection, which is their only mode of protection, refugee law and the Refugee Convention is in itself perpetuating a form of persecution. And so the only solution that I feel is that we should reform the terms and the categories of protection, of persecution, and afford this kind of protection and expand it to groups like Ahmadis, like we see with LGBT groups across countries where there's criminalization of their lives, and giving a group protection to them in the base of group-based asylum. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, Sahar.